Hey friends, welcome back to my house. The sun is setting. It's the evening here as I'm about to read this chapter to you today. I'm actually going to read 2 chapters of The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane. And it's going to be some intense chapters again. A lot of the chapters in The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane really begin to hit on some very deep and sensitive emotions throughout the story. So, let's start to look into today's chapter. Previously on The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane, in chapter 18, we learned that Bryce and Sarah Ruth do have a father. And we learned that he is not a fixture in their home. Sadly, he's a drunk, it says. And he is the person who broke Sarah Ruth's original doll into all those pieces that Edward first heard about. Ooh, that sun is really starting to set. It's beaming right in on us today, isn't it? We also learned that poor little Sarah Ruth is so ill. And she has a horrible cough. And it says that at times she just hugs him so tight. And she spends time with them. And we learn that Edward is often made into a dancing rabbit for little Sarah Ruth. So, when we left off, we were left with that thought of noticing how Edward feels about Sarah. And we hear that he is really sensitive to how sweet and tender she is, and he wishes that he could protect her, and he recognizes that she's terribly ill and that she's so sweet, and he wishes there was something he could do, but he knows that he's limited with his abilities and that there's nothing he can do to help her. So instead, he's just a part of her life and he loves her. We also see that at the very end of the chapter that they all wish upon a star. And I asked you guys in the last chapter to tell me what you think that he would probably wish for as he wished upon her star. And many of you said, and I agree with you, that he probably wished that she would be able to get well, that he could make her better, that he could fly her up to the sky, as he had talked about if he had wings, like the crows and different birds did that they had seen. So, in today's chapter, in chapter 19, there's a couple things, and 20, because we're going to read 2 today. There's a couple things I want you to listen for. The first thing I want you to listen for is, how did Edward feel about being hugged half to death? We're going to hear in chapter 19 about him being hugged half to death. And remember again, this is different. Is it different than when he was hugged very tightly by Abilene in the beginning of the book? How does he feel now about being hugged half to death by Sarah Ruth? Then in chapter 20, there's going to come a point where Bryce tells that he is done. What is it that Bryce is done with? It's after he's made Edward dance, and some things happen in today's chapter, some very serious events, and there's a point where Bryce says that he's done. What is it that Bryce is done with at the end of chapter 20? Okay, and tell me about his feelings there. And how does that connect with Edward as well? All right, let's dive in. Chapter 19 and 20 of The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane. The days passed, the sun rose and set again and again. Sometimes the father came home, sometimes he did not. Edward's ears became soggy. He did not care. His sweater had almost completely unraveled and it didn't bother him. He was hugged half to death and it felt good. In the evenings, at the hands of Bryce, at the ends of the twine, Edward danced and danced. 1 month passed, and then 2, and then 3. Sarah Ruth got worse. In the 5th month, she refused to eat. And in the 6th month, she began to cough up blood. Her breathing became ragged and uncertain, as if she was trying to remember in between breaths what to do, what breathing was. "Breathe, honey." Bryce stood over her and said, "Breathe," thought Edward from deep inside the well of her arms. Please, please breathe. Bryce stopped leaving the house. He sat at home all day and held Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her back and forth and sang to her. On a bright morning in September, Sarah Ruth stopped breathing. "Oh, no," said Bryce. "Oh, honey, take a little breath, please." Edward had fallen out of Sarah Ruth's arms the night before. She had not been asked for again. So face down on the floor, arms over his head, Edward listened as Bryce wept. He listened as the father came home and shouted at Bryce. He listened as the father wept. "You can't cry," Bryce shouted. "You got no right to cry. You never even loved her. You don't know nothing about love." "I loved her," said the father. "I loved her." "I loved her too," thought Edward. "I loved her, and now she is gone. How could this be?" he wondered. How could he bear to live in a world without Sarah Ruth? The yelling between the father and son continued, and then there was a terrible moment when the father insisted that Sarah Ruth belonged to him, that she was his girl, his baby, and that he was taking her to be buried. "She ain't yours," screamed Bryce. "You can't take her. She ain't yours." But the father was bigger and stronger, and he prevailed. He wrapped Sarah Ruth in a blanket and carried her away. The small house became very quiet. Edward could hear Bryce moving around, muttering to himself. Then finally the boy picked up Edward. "Come on, Jangles," Bryce said. "We're leaving. We're going to Memphis." Sometimes when people are in a moment of utmost sadness, when they've lost someone they dearly love, there just aren't words. Sometimes just by simply being there together, that provides strength in a way that nobody could, that no one could understand. And thankfully, I think Bryce has Edward when he's lost everything. And he's taking Bryce, and he's taking Edward, and he's going his way. This is now into chapter 20. "How many dancing rabbits have you seen in your life?" Bryce said to Edward. "I can tell you how many I seen." "One. You. That's how you and me are going to make some money. I seen it the last time I was in Memphis. Folks put on any kind of show right here on the street corner, and people pay 'em for it. I seen it." The walk to town took all night. Bryce walked without stopping, carrying Edward under one arm and talking to him the whole time. Edward's being there for Bryce. Edward tried to listen, but the terrible scarecrow feeling had come back. The feeling he had when he was hanging by his ears in the old lady's garden. The feeling that nothing mattered and that nothing would ever matter again. A lot of times people feel that way when they've experienced a great loss of someone they love. And not only did Edward feel hollow, he ached. Every part of his china body hurt. He ached for Sarah Ruth. He wanted her to hold him. He wanted to dance for her. And he did dance, but it was not for Sarah Ruth. Edward danced for strangers on a dirty street corner in Memphis. Bryce played his harmonica and moved Edward's strings, and Edward bowed and shuffled and swayed, and people stopped to stare and point and laugh. On the ground in front of them was Sarah Ruth's button box. The lid was open to encourage people to drop change inside of it. "Mama," said a small child, "look at that bunny. I want to touch him." He reached out his hand for Edward. "No," said the mother. "Dirty." She pulled the child back away from Edward. "Nasty," she said. A man wearing a hat stopped and stared at Edward and Bryce. "It's a sin to dance," he said. And then after a long pause, he said, "It's a particular sin for rabbits to dance." The man took off his hat and held it over his heart, and he stood and watched the boy and the rabbit for a long time. Finally, he put his hat back on his head and walked away. The shadows lengthened. The sun became an orange, dusty ball low in the sky. Bryce started to cry. Edward saw his tears land on the pavement, but the boy did not stop playing his harmonica. He did not make Edward stop dancing. An old woman, leaning on a cane, stepped up close to them. She stared deep at Edward's eyes, with dark eyes. "Pellegrina?" thought the rabbit. She nodded at him. "Look at me," he said to her. His arms and legs jerked. "Look at me. You got your wish. I have learned how to love, and it's a terrible thing. I'm broken. My heart is broken. Help me." The old woman turned and hobbled away. "Come back," thought Edward. "Fix me." Bryce cried harder. He made Edward dance faster. Finally, when the sun was gone and the streets were dark, Bryce stopped playing his harmonica. "I'm done now," he said. He let Edward fall to the pavement. "I ain't gonna cry any more." Bryce wiped his nose and his eyes with the back of his hand. He picked up the button box and looked inside it. "We got us enough money to get something to eat," he said. "Come on, Jangles." And that's the end of chapter 19 and 20 today. So, a lot of intensity. Sadly, they've lost sweet little Sarah Ruth, which was a thing that poor Bryce was so worried about. And Edward is feeling that deep pain again that he felt before when he's lost those that he loved. This time it's ached awful. And Bryce has experienced this with him. But thankfully, Bryce had Edward, so he was able to kind of lean on him, if you saw, throughout the story as he's dealing with losing poor Sarah Ruth. So remember, now today, grab your paper and pencil. I know you probably already had it ready at the beginning. Here's the 2 things I want to know. How did Edward feel about Sarah Ruth hugging him half to death? And at the end of the chapter, in chapter 20, what was it that Bryce was done with when he stopped and he said, "I'm done now"? What was he done with? Why was he done with it? What was it that he was experiencing there? That's your 2 questions I want you to answer today. But one more thing before I go. Did you notice it said he thought he saw Pellegrina? I wonder what that's going to mean. Kind of a cliffhanger for the next chapters. Not many chapters left in our story. All right, I love you guys. Be sure and give me your answers. I'll see you tomorrow on the miraculous journey of Edward Tulane. Bye.